Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this second day of the London Climate Action Week and to this 90 minutes focusing on corporate climate action. So my name is Sam Baker. I'm a Deloitte partner, but I'm really here in my capacity as the leader of the Goal 13 Impact Platform. It's an initiative that we'll talk about a little bit more as we go through the session. So in terms of the agenda today, we have a keynote from Lord Karen Bilimoria. We're delighted to have him. Unfortunately, not in person, so to speak, not in virtual person. He has pre-recorded something for us. He can't be with us, but we're very delighted that we can have him speak to us. We're then going to hear from Tom Butcher, the Met Office. So the Met Office is one of the partners on the Goal 13 Impact Platform. Tom is really going to give us an update on the urgency with which we need to respond because of the increase in emissions, the increase in the implications of those emissions, and draw on some recent research from the Met Office. I will then talk about this initiative that I've mentioned a couple of times already, but then the bulk of the time will be spent in the panel, and the panel has got representatives from Volvo, from Nestle, from IHG, and from the capital markets and the guys of RWC partners. So absolutely delighted to have those four on, and we'll just introduce them in 2 seconds. Throughout this, but certainly at the end, please do use the chat function or the Q&A facility to ask questions. I will read those and then direct them to various panelists and speakers as we go. So thank you very much. So if we could just move on to the panelists themselves. So a big welcome to you. Thank you very much for contributing to the session. So there we have Catherine Dolton, so the Chief Sustainability Officer for IHG Hotels and Resorts. A participant on the platform. I'm delighted to have you with us. Jonas Otterheim, so the Head of Climate Action at Volvo Cars. Some interesting recent research. If you go to LinkedIn and look up Jonas, you'll see some interesting things there. We've got Owen Bethel, representing Nestle, a Senior Manager in the Environmental Impact for Global Public Affairs. Very interesting, again, in the news in the last couple of days around the labelling initiative that Nestle is one part of. And then finally, John Deehan, representing the capital markets. John has a blog, look it up. It's all good stuff and deals with ESG and ESG-related matters. So thank you to all of the participants. We're going to discuss 3 specific things. The first, really, what is driving your climate action within your organizations and how should you organize against it? The second is then upstream and downstream initiatives. So what are you actually doing about it? But not focusing on the operational boundaries, but upstream and downstream. And then the third is around the importance of collaboration. So a theme that comes through loud and clear again and again. And I just sort of want to unpick that, listen to a few examples for us all really to reflect on where collaboration is critical and where perhaps it reduces efficacy and efficiency, and it's better off us sort of moving forward on our own within our corporate boundaries. So thank you again to everybody, and let's move forward to listen to Lord Karen.
Good morning, everyone. This is London's 3rd Climate Action Week. And every year on the road to net zero, we make more and more progress. And just think back to 2008, a little more than a decade ago, the UK's Climate Change Act made history. It was a world's first, committing us to cut our emissions by 80% from 1990s levels. And since then, we've seen the roots of a green industrial revolution here in the UK, working together with government and business and scientists and all parts of society. We've already cut our carbon by around 62%. I think that's a terrific feat. The UK used to be almost totally dependent on coal and fossil fuels, but for the past 3 years, for the first time, the majority of our energy supply has come from low carbon sources. I mean, that's a staggering transformation. It's a shift that's not only helped us to cut carbon, but it's also brought jobs and opportunity to the UK in industries from offshore wind to making electric cars. But, and this is the transformation is nowhere near over yet. This year, 2021, our country, the United Kingdom, has a unique opportunity. We just lived through a global pandemic, and we now face the immense task of rebuilding our economy. This cliche term, build back better. Well, I was hosting an event at the CBI with the mayor of Athens, and he says, we don't talk about build back better, we talk about build forward better. So how are we going to build forward better? There are only 125 days left before COP26, the UN's climate summit hosted by the UK for the first time. Time is running out. So if we're going to halve global carbon emissions and prevent the Earth's temperature rising above 1.5 degrees, now is the time to act. So last month at CBI, we launched a new strategy for the UK economy, setting out exactly how we can do that. And we've titled this Seize the Moment. This is our economic strategy for the United Kingdom for the next decade up to 2030. And one of the key pillars of the strategy is decarbonizing our economy. So how do we get there? So I think we can do it. And I want to express it in 3 Ps. Planning, partnership, passion. So planning. The UK's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution is very ambitious. Covers everything from renewable energy to electric cars to green homes to green finance and more. But now businesses want to see the detail and the timeframes for delivery. A heat and building strategy, our transport decarbonisation plan, our hydrogen strategy, the Treasury's net zero review. These are all policy papers that we hope to see published as soon as possible. And then businesses can roll up our sleeves and get going. The second P is partnership. Because of the scale of challenge, we can't do this with government doing it on its own or industry doing it on its own. It's government and industry and university and all parts of society working together. And we've seen some great joint endeavors just this year. I mean, this year I always say 2021 is a watershed year for the United Kingdom. Not only is Brexit over, having left the European Union 31st of January 2020, with the transition period ending at the 31st of December 2020, this year is a real watershed year for the UK, where the CBI, I was proud to chair the B7, the business summit for the preeminent business organizations in the G7 countries. And of course, this year we also had South Africa, we had South Korea, we had India and Australia, and of course, Business Europe sitting at the table. When we may have left the European Union, but we will never leave Europe, and the CBI continues to be a member of Business Europe. So the B7 fed directly into the G7, and climate action was right at the top of the agenda. And then at the CBI, we've had the Heat Commission, which I was privileged to chair, and the Heat Commission was in partnership, to prove my point that I just said earlier, with the University of Birmingham, where I happen to be Chancellor, proud to be Chancellor of the University of Birmingham. And this partnership with the University of Birmingham CBI looked at how do we decarbonize our buildings. 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions comes from heat and half that comes from buildings. So if we do not address the decarbonization of heat in the 28 million homes in the UK, only 1 million of them today are up to the standard. If we don't deal with that, upgrading those buildings to heat pumps, to hydrogen boilers, to community heating, we're not going to reach net zero by 2050. And the Heat Commission came out with a strategy of how to implement that, including with the proposition of a central delivery body, like an Olympic delivery style body, the National Centre for the Decarbonisation of Heat, which we feel could be located in the Midlands in association with organisations like the University of Birmingham. In transport, we have manufacturers like Nissan and Jaguar Land Rover helping us to switch to electric vehicles. And in London, our capital, we have Transport for London, have already rolled out hydrogen-powered buses. In the Midlands, the University of Birmingham has got a hydrogen-powered train that is up and running. So this shows what's possible even during a pandemic. All these innovations at scale can make a huge difference. Finally, the third P, passion. In my role at the CBI, I talk to businesses every day. And many of these businesses are passionate about climate action and climate change. We've heard from many of them at the CBI's Net Zero Conference. Just held very recently. For example, the chief executive of GridServe made a passionate case for electric cars. And he said, a better vehicle that costs you less, what's not to love? And politicians, our COP26 president and cabinet minister Alok Sharma said, net zero is good for your bottom line. And at the B7, the prime minister said, net zero is not a zero-sum game. And in true Boris style, he said, green is good. Now back to the net zero conference I was speaking about. We had media superstars like the rock star Annie Lennox, and we had the brilliant Richard Curtis. They spoke about green investing, and they asked, what's the point of inheriting a pension in a world on fire? So here in the UK, 1/3 of our largest businesses have already pledged to eliminate their contribution to carbon emissions by 2050. These firms, these companies represent a total market capitalization of over 650 billion pounds. Now that's a commitment, but of course we can go further. So at the CBI, we're delighted to be working in partnership with Deloitte. Deloitte, of course, were major sponsors of the B7 summit, and we're very grateful for all Deloitte support. So we're working in partnership with Deloitte on our Goal 13 impact platform. This is an online tool for businesses of all sizes to share and find information about decarbonizing. If you're already a leading net zero company, please sign up to showcase what you're doing. Maybe a company in a sector of yours can learn from you. Or if your business just starting on the net zero journey, why not have a look, see what others like you are doing, and pledge to act. Our target is to see 1,000 businesses signed up by COP26 in November. So there's a challenge. I sincerely hope that you will join us. So if we can achieve all this, just imagine the future we can build together. A future with green jobs in every part of the country. A future with at least 240,000 net new jobs in the next decade at our latest estimate. And this term leveling up, spreading prosperity across the regions of the United Kingdom. We could do that. We can do that with new clusters, which I've been passionate about for years. Clusters with businesses and universities from Sutton to South Shields. And you've got the Cambridge cluster around the university, which is a tech cluster energy. Now it's a tech and bioscience and life sciences. And of course, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine created by Oxford University and AstraZeneca, British Swedish company. Where's AstraZeneca headquartered? In Cambridge. So there's clusters is very powerful. And we can create healthier cities. I'm on the University of Oxford Healthy Cities Commission with cleaner air, water, biodiversity. And this year, the Dasgupta Review, led by Sir Partha Dasgupta of the University of Cambridge, described nature as our most precious asset. He said that some 1 million animal and plant species are believed to be threatened with extinction. Together we can prevent this. And Sir David Attenborough, national treasure, what he said when he commented on the Dasgupta Review, he said that this comprehensive and immensely important report shows us how, by bringing economics and ecology face to face, we can help save the natural world, and in doing so, save ourselves. And in London, globally recognized for financial expertise, we can become the world's #1 decarbonization enabler. So that, as my friend, the Lord Mayor, William Russell, said recently, in future, green finance will simply be known as finance. So if we work together, I truly believe the transformation we need is possible. And the work starts right here, right now, and it starts with us. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone.
So, Lord Karen, so just before we go there, Viv, we're going to listen to Tom. So, yeah, if you just take the slide down, so, and we'll just have Tom talking. So, I think, yeah, lots of passion on display there. So the 3 Ps, planning, clearly very important. And I think that obviously we've heard from the the Climate Change Commission earlier in the week around that, and so some sort of challenges about whether or not that planning is really in place, but clearly planning is a crucial and critical part. Partnership, we're going to talk about that later as part of the panel. So partnership, yeah, very important, lots of great examples from Lord Garron there, and then certainly plenty of passion on display. And I think, yes, you know, passion can carry the day, and we definitely need to be there and inspire each other on this. So with that, and that was obviously quite a lot of the focus on the UK and UK's opportunity with COP26, but if we could now just sort of step back a little bit, so give the floor to you, Tom, just to you know, reflect perhaps on, you know, what's happening climate-wise in the short and medium term and some of the implications. So Viv, if we can lose that slide and just have Tom on camera, that would be good. But Tom, please, off you go.
Thank you very much, Sam. Well, most of you will be aware that the 2015 Paris Agreement aims to keep global temperature rise this century to well below 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels. And it also aims to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further down to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, currently, those national commitments to cut emissions and achieve this goal fall short of what is required. In 2020, global average temperatures were recorded as approximately 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. A recent report led by some of my colleagues at the Met Office indicates that there is a 40% chance of us temporarily exceeding global average temperatures of above 1.5 degrees Celsius over the next 5 years. Now, on the face of it, these headline numbers might not seem that significant. And after personally just experiencing a pretty miserable, wet and not very warm midsummer weekend in the southwest of England, who wouldn't appreciate it being a degree or two warmer? Well, the speed of change here is important. And we know that up until the start of the 20th century, global average temperatures remained more or less consistent since the last ice age 11,000 years ago. The increase in temperatures since then has been unprecedented. Using climate change prediction models, we can link these changes in global average temperatures to emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, carbon dioxide hangs around a long time in the atmosphere from anywhere from between 20 to 200 years or more. And this means that our efforts to curb those emissions now and over the next couple of decades will only really start to kick in and have an impact on rising temperatures by the second half of this century. And this is important as it means that there is a clear need to begin adapting to climate change as well as to reduce emissions. Now, the reality is that when we're talking about global average temperatures, we're masking a more complex picture. For example, warming over land is greater than warming over the seas because the oceans are constantly mixing themselves up. And warming at the poles is much greater than at lower latitudes. And this is because of a process called Arctic amplification. And that's leading to accelerating melting of the ice sheets and associated impacts on ecosystems and sea levels. Our climate prediction models also help us to understand how the frequency and also the severity of extreme weather events will respond to changes in global average temperatures. Attribution studies show us that we are already experiencing extreme events that have been exacerbated by climate change today. For example, the chance of a heat wave like the one that we saw in the UK in 2018 is currently somewhere between 10 and 25% in any given year. This is 30 times more likely in today's climate than it was in pre-industrial times. By 2050, the chance of a 2018 heat wave each year rises to around 50%. So this means that on average, every other year will be at least as warm as 2018. Similar attribution studies indicate an increase in the frequency and severity of other extreme events around the world, such as those from flood risk or extreme heat in India, extreme river flows and flooding in the US, devastating bushfires in Australia, and other linked hazards such as locust swarms in sub-Saharan Africa. The west coast of the US is currently experiencing drought and heat wave conditions that is reported as the worst in 1,200 years. And although a full study has not yet been completed because the event is still unfolding, scientists around the world are already indicating that the duration and the severity of this event is likely to have been exacerbated by climate change. Businesses need to adapt their infrastructure, their operations, their strategies to remain sustainable and thrive in the coming decades. And there's perhaps three main areas to think about. The first is the direct impacts on the resilience of infrastructure and operations, from things like heat stress on outdoor workers, or perhaps risks associated with flooding on infrastructure. The second, as has been mentioned already, is the impact on supply chains. So this could include the supply of ingredients from around the world, which could have been disrupted by a heat wave, say in India, or disruption to shipping, to energy supply, or also we're going to hear about later, financing or perhaps insurance might be other important considerations here. The third aspect is around changes to consumer behavior and the associated impact on business strategy. So this could include things like changes to patterns of tourism or changes in the demand for specific consumer products. Adaptation and resilience often gets reviewed as the poor cousin to activities to reduce carbon and the race to net zero. It seems to me that there's a real imperative for businesses to act and act now to adapt to future climate, to continue to thrive, as well as continuing their efforts to reduce their emissions and to cut carbon. Thank you, Sam, back to you.
Tom, thank you very much. Sobering, but I think a really good reminder that, particularly if some of those sort of, value stocks, John, that you look after, these big organizations, you have massive resources who are fundamental to emissions reduction, managing that and investing in the innovation, they have to be, they have to protect themselves from the vicissitudes of the short and medium term change, which is going to happen. So, and hence this need to sort of make sure that adaptation isn't forgotten about. So anyway, thank you very much, Tom, for those points. So yes, Viv, if I can now just introduce the Goal 13 Impact Platform Initiative quickly, which Lord Karen talked about. And I'll start straight at the bottom of this slide because, Karen called out Deloitte. Well, actually, it is a non-commercial partnership between 6 organizations. So the CBI, obviously, we've heard from the CBI, we've heard from the Met Office. So both of those are partners. We've got Chapter Zero. If you don't know that, that's the World Economic Forum's climate governance initiative in the UK called Chapter Zero for non-exec directors. So if you are a non-exec director, please sign up, go onto the website and sign up. A4S, also known as the Prince's Accounting for Sustainability project, focusing on the finance function, particularly in the CFO and the role of the CFO in sustainability and climate. And then Dell, who are helping us build the platform. So that's how it's set up. On the left-hand side, what are we trying to achieve? So I think that, we started this 14 months ago, and we thought there was a need to create a repository of climate action. We thought there was a bit of a gap where a repository of climate action by companies, which was international, free to access, didn't really exist across both emissions reduction and resilience and adaptation. There are a number of different databases, not detracting from those at all, but we felt there was a gap in the opportunity to do what we talk in that second bullet, which is really just to amplify company progress. So what we're not doing is assuring or striping people good, medium, bad. What we want to do is take the stories, climate-related action stories that companies have, and put them on a platform and allow people to look at them in a comparable fashion in order to drive learning, first of all, very important. Secondly, hopefully to move from learning towards collaboration, so getting companies to work together, or just connecting them. So, and then thirdly, is potentially getting them to work together where you get more than 2 people, more than 2 companies working on a common issue. And so that's not the people related to the platform driving those initiatives. We are there just to try and broker them and initiate interest and get people to join up. The third point is that we spend a lot of our time on working groups with different initiatives, be they, trade associations or ICC driven, SME Net Zero or whatever else it might be. And part of our role here we see is to try and perhaps help people work through the fog and the noise. So this isn't COVID fog, this is sort of, the climate initiative fog where, you get so many different initiatives out there. It's very exciting, but it's also quite difficult to navigate. And so I thumb in many, many different pies, and we try and make those connections just to try and rationalize it for people, and particularly the people who we interview. the partners, the businesses who come onto the platform, just to try as a small contribution as we work towards COP26. So in terms of the approach, it's pretty straightforward. So typically we get somebody like CBI who've got a strong business membership to reach out to their members. We've got arms and legs, typically from Deloitte, who then engage with those companies or those members, carry out an interview. It's a structured interview. We then codify that, we iterate it with the company, and we put that onto our platform. And then finally, we promote those objectives of learning, collaboration, and collective action, both on the platform, but then also off the platform. And we'll touch on that in 2 seconds. So on the left-hand side, I've just got the sort of list of topics that we ask about, that we capture on the platform. Yes, we do ask about targets and commitments, but we're particularly interested in the process and the sort of the whys and the wherefores of that, rather than necessarily the things that you can find already on somebody's website. We do talk about how organizations are organizing their climate-related activities, and we're going to hear about that today from the panelists. We ask about why you're doing this. So what external or internal, stakeholder is forcing that change? Where is it coming from? And what level of urgency does that imply, and the level of change? And then we drop down to the initiatives themselves. So very often that conversation is around operational initiatives. We're going to focus on upstream and downstream today. And then we cover off barriers and lessons learned. So it's an engaging hour, certainly for us, and I hope for the people who get interviewed. We've reached out to 3,000 companies. We've interviewed 330 we get about a 20% positive response rate. And we are not confined by geography, by sector, or by size, although we have a bit of a sort of dominant UK focus at the moment, and largely larger organizations. But we are spreading out. And at the bottom, we've got a sort of very ambitious target from where we are at the moment to have 1,000 interviews done by COP26. But if we did, I think that would be a phenomenal contribution that we can offer up. So we amplify what we hear in 3 different ways. The first is on the platform. And so we've got a link there. We'll send these slides out around afterwards, but there's a link there to the platform. Bit in the middle talks about the slicing and dicing of the different contributions and ways of viewing it. There's also an opportunity to create some case studies, which we do if companies are interested to bring out particular aspects of the interview or their climate journey. So on the left, there's an opportunity to contribute online rather than through an interview. We recommend an interview, but that's a possibility. And on the right, there's an opportunity to see the company profile in full. So where permission has been given, we can actually then see the interview. We are busy doing the matchmaking functionality at the moment, and we very much hope that's going to be released in the next week and a half, which will allow companies to reach out directly as opposed to via us. The second way is via events. So events like this, great opportunities to hear from the participants, record it, put it up on the website, get other people engaged, and just to stimulate some of that learning and collaboration, not directly to do with the interview, but to do with your stories. And then the final way is through reports. So in terms of reports, we did one in September. We'll do another one for COP26. And once again, there's an opportunity here to engage with us as we develop that report. We profile the good stories, and we just try and catalyze that learning and collaboration. So that's what the platform is. If you'd like to engage, there's a number of different reasons why you should on the left-hand side. I think I've touched on, hopefully, on all of those. But if you do want to engage on the right-hand side, then the critical thing is the third email. So Goal13 Impact Platform, Deloitte.co.uk. Please hit that, or put something in the chat. Thank you, Eva. I see that. We'll reach out to you. So put something in the chat, and we'll reach out to you. The only thing we haven't touched on is on the left-hand side. Think of this, please, if you're a business, as the opportunity also to engage with your business partners. So you can use the platform and use us to reach out to your suppliers or other business partners, upstream, downstream, to understand what they're doing about climate a little bit more, but also possibly as a basis of broader engagement. So that's the platform. So if we can move forward to the panel. So we've got 3 topics, as I've talked about. I will précis those topics very, very quickly because we do want to get into the stories from the panelists. So the first topic is really what's driving climate action, and then secondly, how are you organizing your climate-related activities? And so the sort of nuggets from the platform, I guess, we do ask about the drivers of change. So one of the key things is the most important driver of change is the market, be that B2B or B2C, and that sort of conflates really demand which is seen both as a product or service directly addressing climate change or indirectly because it's being produced in a low carbon way. The second thing is commercial opportunity. So obviously if it's market related, that speaks at least to some form of business opportunity, perhaps not necessarily profitable, but some sort of business opportunity. But also we see a lot of carbon emissions activity closely aligned to efficiency, so greater efficiency. And so commercial opportunity is the second big driver. The third is internal motivation, so top down, but also employees and indeed the employee proposition. So getting new employees in, particularly to industries like oil and gas and to nuclear, who perhaps have had more of a challenge recruiting talent. You can see that from the age of their workforces. So that's a key part, but top down or employee, always seen as important, not necessarily the top driver. And the fourth one, it'll be obviously very interesting to hear what John has to say about this, but investor expectations. So everybody flags this. It's a hot area. The level of engagement with investors and from investors is increasing. The level of demands are. However, there is an outstanding question for many companies, which quite how urgent it is, what an imperative that creates to respond. Because I think there's a little bit of a sense of there's other capital out there still. A lot of companies are not divesting, but offering advice or trying to put pressure on through stewardship. If they own a small proportion of the shares and they don't collaborate with other shareholders, then potentially the demand is relatively constrained. So on to the next slide, just around organization very quickly. So when we do ask people about organization, we ask about the positioning of the program, the scope of that program, who's involved, so which functions, and think about the resources, but also how those organizations are managed and coordinated. And then we've brought together a little maturity cycle, if you like, to think about which companies sit where. On the left-hand side, overlay. So really the business is cracking on, but you've got some brave people in the organization who've got the climate target and the emissions target, and they're trying to make sure that that is met, notwithstanding the fact the business is carrying on doing whatever it did before. Over on the far side, and it's not necessarily unimportant, it could be hugely important. It's just this it's almost conflicting. There's a trade-off with the core business. On the far right, we have fully integrated, where there's a real sense that climate has been integrated into the business model. There's no sense of trade-off. There's there is no lack of education in the business about what you're doing and how you're doing it, and it's felt to be strengthening and supporting the business rather than necessarily an additional piece. So that's really what we talk about. But now, please, we can take the slides off and then over to the panel. So, Catherine, if I could ask you, please, to kick off, it'd be great to hear about IHG.
Great. So I'll just start with the why climate action one, right, Sam? In the first instance. So I think for us, we've past 12 to 18 months, I would say in particular, and that has been particularly from our B2B customers. Us, we clearly have some really big corporate customers around the world who stay in our hotels, who we negotiate with on behalf of all of our franchisees. And more than 80% of those big global customers now have their own net zero.
Yeah, Catherine, I don't know if
Sorry.
Catherine, you're dipping in and out a little bit. Sorry, I think you're back on.
I'm back on. Apologies. It's my computer, I think, unfortunately, unstable. So I was just saying, so we're seeing a lot coming from our big corporate customers around what is the carbon footprint of a stay, really interested as well on how we can work together on certain initiatives such as waste-free meetings, etc., etc. And I think what and those big corporates trying to mandate certain policies around travel, it's about how can we work together to help to incentivize travelers in those companies to make the right choices. So that's been a really big impact, those big B2B customers. I think for us, the wider consumer base, it was interesting to hear Tom talking about that might have on travel in the future, that's something that we're thinking about and trying to think about actually how we can measure that. And I think that's hard, right? Because if you ask consumers whether they care about the environment when they're traveling, they're going to say yes. But we need to think about actually how that translates into those spending patterns. So definitely a big change from consumers. Our employees as well, our colleagues, just really want to work for, we know want to work for a company that has that bigger societal impact. Responsible Business 10-year plan earlier this year, and that has gone down brilliantly with our colleagues. And then the shareholder interest and more questions. At IHG, and there was a time that, you know, G type questions would be to me as head of IR rather than to the CEO and CFO, and they're certainly getting more questions from our main shareholders now.
Excellent, thank you, Catherine. So perhaps Owen, can we bring you in? And maybe just touch on both the sort of drivers of change and how you're organising internally, please.
Yeah, sure. So I would describe the process that we've gone through as really one of mainstreaming. So we made our net zero commitment just less than 2 years ago in September 2019. We kind of decided that internally a little bit before that. So it's really a sort of 2-year anniversary thinking back on the process of making that commitment. And for a number of years, we talked to external partners like NGOs and academics around climate and the environment, and really we did a lot connected to our own operations, I would say. So we had really a focus on scope 1 and 2, on our environmental impact locally, on things like water resources, and on making sure our factories operated in an environmentally sustainable way. But then that sort of debate started to become more mainstream. We started to see more mainstream investors raising it with us, more consumer action, you know, a lot of protests around the world a few years ago on this topic. And also the political motivation from countries really started to grow as well. So I think it was a question of seeing a process that was to some extent an academic discussion becoming really a mainstream societal one. And as a company that, you know, operates in 187 countries, we are very in tune, or we try to be very in tune with what's going on. And we saw that, and we knew that we had to act and to make our commitment the gold standard, if you like. So 1.5 degree aligned, scope 1, 2, and 3, and covering our entire value chain, where previously it had been more focused on our operations. So I think the pressures were different, but it's really this process of something that was to some extent, we've got these motion activated lights in the office, and they turn off occasionally if I don't move. They're very good for energy efficiency, by the way. And so, yeah, so this process kind of went from the side to the center, and Nestlé reacted accordingly. Then in terms of how we've changed our company, I think it's almost the same thing. So environmental topics went from being an operational and public affairs type concern to being really a mainstream business function. So each one of our strategic business units has a sustainability manager now. We have an ESG strategy and deployment unit, which was created specifically to deal with climate change. We've set out investment figures for how we're going to help change the way our ingredients are grown. And we've got people working in pretty much every country that we're present in on these topics. So again, it's really kind of changed from being something that we tried to address through tweaking our approach to really fundamentally changing the purpose of our company and the way that we operate.
Great, thank you. And if you thought of that spectrum from sort of, you know, overlay that we laid out to sort of fully integrated, where, you know, this is absolutely understood to be a key long-term or medium-term value driver, Owen, I'll offer you a chance to position yourself on that spectrum.
In terms of whether it's a key value driver, yeah, I mean, yeah, I would say definitely. If you look at the different categories that we operate in, you're seeing a lot of competition on shelf for lower carbon products, for alternative protein products, which we're both in both categories we're very active. I think that for me, it's really about embedding value in brands. So if you've got a well-established brand, people trust, they want to see that that brand is addressing their concerns about climate, which are growing day by day or month by month. And so I think we have an opportunity to lock in long-term value for our established brands and to launch new things as well, such as we recently launched a brand called Wonder, which is a plant-based milk based on pea protein. It's carbon neutral from the offset, so starting carbon neutral on the market. And I mean, it's competing in a space which is growing in popularity, and that kind of new opportunity offers growth potential for Nestlé, alongside adding value to our existing brands and products.
Good, fantastic, thank you. Jonas, can we hear from you, please?
Yes, of course. Starting off with, I thought Lord Bilimoria's intro and also what you talked about with the sort of insights you have, what is driving climate action, is rather interesting. And of course, I very much agree that sort of changing customer behavior, changing customer demands is a big driver for us as well. But that is not necessarily the biggest driver at the moment. We see, of course, customers ask for fully electric vehicles, but they are not really used to use them yet. So it's a big sort of change mechanism we need to sort of have here to, well, teach them what is an electric car and why is it important. So I'd rather see what Tom talked about as the biggest driver, because if we just listen to what science says, then either we act right now, it can look costly, but then we will be better positioned in the future. Or if we don't act, then, well, global warming will hit and countries will realize at a late stage that this will, well, it's getting worse and worse. So at one point in time, I really see that, well, either we are well positioned or this will be completely existential for us. So either we act right now or we are faced with a rather big hurdle, well, in the coming years. And that is, of course, a long-term game, but also a short-term. We can see that right now. Usually we talk about selling cars to customers, but a rather big chunk of who's buying a car are companies like the others in this call, fleet customers. So different companies that buy cars and use them for their company purpose. And these companies, since they have, well, rather high ambitions on reducing CO2, they put those requirements on us. So we see that we need to act right now and step our game really fast to just avoid losing customers today. And that is, well, very much business critical. So sort of the driver is very much, of course, customer change, but also, to me, I'm looking forward to hearing from John soon, but to me, this is very much business sense to do this. And that is probably the biggest change in the automotive industry in a while. Sort of previously we saw it as a legislation reason, but now it's rather the business critical reason. But talking shortly about organizing for it as well, when we set our strategy, we talk about climate neutrality by 2040 and to reduce by 40% per average car between 2018 and 2025. So a long-term absolute target and a short-term intensity target. And that, or those targets and more or less everything we do is broken down more or less a direct copy of how the greenhouse gas protocol is structured. So we break it down into the subcategories of the protocol and we steer the emissions according to how you are to calculate and report to just ensure that we capture all emissions. And therefore, when setting targets and when organizing for it, we have more or less tried to, well, mirror how this is set up to ensure we don't miss any emissions. And of course, there are a few overlaps where we need to collaborate a lot internally, but similar to what Nestlé talked about here, sort of, we have delegated responsibility for the different functions, so they have their part of this bigger chunk, and also to ensure that when taking both big and small investment decisions, for example, they are forced to show the CO2 effect of those investments early on to at least know how these will affect the long-term game.
Very good. Thank you, Jonas. Fascinating. So, John, voice of the investor.
Well, it's incredible. What we've seen in the last couple of years has just been phenomenal in terms of ESG investing, and particularly on climate. And I guess the question is, why climate action now? And it's hard to really put your finger on what is really driving it in the last couple of years, because NGOs and investor groups have been banging the drum for decades around this issue. But to use an unfortunate phrase, the dam seems to have burst in the last 2 years. And to give you a kind of a sense for that, there are a couple of things that have been driving it. One, I would say, is regulation. The European Green Deal with EU taxonomy, with SFDR, is driving us as investors to really think about sustainability issues, and climate being foremost among that. So regulation is pushing it. I would say the other thing that is really forcing people to think are capital flows. And we think about capital flows, we think of a business, a company looking to get capital from the capital markets, be it equity or debt. But you can also think of it from a different point of view. Us as asset managers, we need capital to deploy, or else we go out of business. And what we saw in 2020 was something really phenomenal, where there was a huge flow of money into ESG funds. Bernstein estimate that 200 billion went into ESG funds, where 100 billion went out of all active funds. So if you think about that, it's a tremendous signal and wake-up call to asset managers that they need to integrate ESG. So that's the business push for it. So you've got regulation pushing from one direction, you've got the flows going the other direction. So it's making asset managers think, okay, I need to get on top of ESG and I need to integrate it. It then is, when you think of the clients that are looking at that integration, they need to understand whether it's genuine or not. So when we will pitch for a mandate, there will be an ESG section that will be weighted on, there will be a score given to it, and that will determine, along with some other factors, whether we win that business. So I think that really is happening across the asset managers, is that we understand, both from a commercial point of view, a regulatory point of view, we've got to get with this. But I would also say there's an increasing awareness. There's an awareness of the climate issues, that we have to move. We have to be part of the solution. We can't duck our responsibility. We can't be active managers and be passive on these great societal problems that we're facing, great climate issues. So I think that is giving a sense of purpose to the industry. And I believe, and personally at least, this has given us all a sense of purpose and a mission that we can really contribute to one of the great problems that we're facing.
Excellent, John, thank you. And I think when we get into the next topic, so around sort of initiatives and then even collaboration at the end, I think I'm really interested to understand, because I understand that the capital markets have been driven by, regulation in part, as you led on. It's fantastic. There's that sense of purpose, and I guess the question is then, does something get lost from the industry recognizing it, as in the capital markets recognizing they need to change, and in fact it's mandated by regulation? Does something get lost in the translation in their interaction with investee companies? So as we get into the next topic, perhaps we could just sort of reflect on that, and everybody else might have a reflection on that as well. But Catherine, I recognize that you didn't mention, we didn't talk through ISG and organisation, so could we just touch on that before we move on? That'd be great. Yeah,
and hopefully my connection's a bit better now, so apologies if it's not. So I think at IHG we've had a responsible business board committee for some years, but we made a big change at the beginning of this year that has made a real difference to us, which was creating a separate pillar for the corporate strategy around our people, communities and planet. So before it was responsible business was a bit of an underpin, whereas now it is a key priority pillar of the strategy, which in turn has just meant the traction we're getting within the business in terms of getting that executive level sponsorship for some of the programs that we're doing has made a real difference for us. I think the other thing we try and do as well is just ensure we're set up to engage with the operations. So it's all very well us sort of creating this strategy at a corporate level, but we do have 6,000 hotels out there. Biggest markets, US and China. And the US certainly, they're still suffering, and Europe suffering from COVID. So it's actually how do we engage, and I'll talk about it more when we talk about initiatives. You know, how do we set ourselves up for success in driving that action in what is predominantly a franchise business model?
Excellent, thank you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to conflate the two questions that we had because I think that you know, they're closely related, and I think we can probably address them together. So there were two sort of focuses. One is upstream and downstream initiatives, and the second one was collaboration. So just to sort of précis these just very quickly. So when we capture the different initiatives on the platform and ask people what the top 3 most impactful initiatives are, we do think about where in the value chain they lie. So are they operational, downstream or upstream? And then we classify them. We try and classify them by domain, and we're sort of, what's the impact or what's the focus of those initiatives? So is it buildings? Is it low carbon? Is it you know, waste reduction, etc., as you see there? And the percentages are the percentages of the interviews that are currently on the platform and how they fall out. So the number of initiatives in the top 3 initiatives, the proportion, sorry, of initiatives in the top 3 initiatives which fall under each category. So the key point here, I guess, is that perhaps not surprisingly, most of the initiatives being carried out at the moment, cited as the most impactful, are actually, notwithstanding all the drivers, are actually within the boundaries of the organization, within your scope of control, close to home. You know, reasonably closely followed by downstream, so customers, so broadly in line with the commentary about the marketplace. But it does tend to be engagement rather than necessarily products and services at this stage. And I might want to mention the labeling initiative that's just popped up, but I mean, obviously, if the customer doesn't really understand what they're asking for, and the company can't really sort of display and communicate that, even if they could, you know, it's not a very efficient market, and it's not really going to happen. So there's a big emphasis on engagement downstream, and actually a much smaller number here of overall impactful initiatives are really falling to sourcing in the supply chain, notwithstanding scope 3 targets being so important. And I think our sort of, you know, the sub bullet under that at the very highest level is just, it's difficult. These are fragmented, it's complex, and it's costly. And so how to do that efficiently and effectively is an ongoing challenge. So then just to the second piece, and the second part of the question, which is around collaboration. So Lord Karen talked about it. So Viv, if you can just flip to the next slide. So Lord Karen talked about it. We ask, you know, around, you know, lessons learned, or a variety of different ways in our interview, and collaboration pops up again and again and again. And we've got to do much more work at sort of dissecting this and developing some of the ideas. But I think at the very highest level, I mean, first of all, over 30% of organizations are actually calling this out without prompting as a critical thing. And it might be internally to the organization, but more likely to be external. And just these sort of 3 different, I guess, elements to it. One is opportunity. People want to collaborate. Competitors want to collaborate with each other. Individuals are stimulated to do this, whether that's because of, you know, John's sort of purpose-led sort of sense or Lord Karen's passion. It doesn't really matter. The point is, you know, it's an opportunity because people are willing to do it. The second is capability. I think people are recognizing that actually, either just because, you know, you don't maybe have the technical resource or whatever else it might be, or because your sector might require actually a fundamental reorganization. I think there's a sense that capability is a critical sort of gap typically, and actually collaboration helps plug that gap. And then finally, a number of different sort of, if you like, direct motivations. I think at the top right, it's around influencing policy. So there's a lot of concern that a lack of clear policy in the planning. So that second part of Lord Karen's 3 Ps, if that's not there, there's too much uncertainty and it doesn't unlock the dollars. So working with government and collaborating really important. The second, it's just a great way of getting your message out, but also learning what others are doing. And I hope that in a small way, that's what our initiative does. And then at the bottom, nakedly commercial. It's cheaper. You know, we don't want to, you know, try lots of different options ourselves, and we don't need to when others are doing it as well. So get together, do some collective action. It's cheaper, it's quicker, it's great value. So anyway, lots of different reasons. So if we can just conflate those 2 things then, and maybe start with you, and just ask about then sort of upstream and downstream initiatives, you know, what's happening there, and then perhaps move on to, or if you don't touch on that directly, move on to the collaboration point.
Yeah, sure. So very happy to answer both of those questions. So in terms of the focus area for Nestle, it's really on the upstream supply chain. So we have over 500,000 farmers who are supplying either directly or indirectly to Nestle, and that's a range of ingredients, including milk and coffee and cocoa, as I mentioned before. And those farmers need support in transitioning to a more regenerative method of production. And that's the key really to reducing our emissions significantly. 95% in scope 3, of which a significant proportion are from the dairy industry. So we need to work with farming organizations, with suppliers on implementing new techniques, making sure that they are rewarded for implementing those techniques as well, that we go through what is called a just transition, where farmer incomes don't suffer as a result of us imposing something on them. It needs to be a collaborative model. And also we need to learn as we go, right? Nature doesn't necessarily react like an industrial process. You need to test and learn. You need to see what works in different climatic conditions. And as Tom mentioned before, those climatic conditions are changing. So we need to think about adaptation as we go through this process. So we need to develop, for example, more resistant strains of things like coffee and cocoa, which can cope with increased temperatures or drought. So I think the big focus is there. We've already allocated 1.2 billion Swiss francs between now and 2025 to helping facilitate that transition. But we're also working on keeping our own house in order, of course. So investing in sustainable logistics, switching to 100% renewable electricity, working on the thermal piece. So the thermal energy, which is created in our factories, that's a bit more challenging. That takes a little bit longer because of the lack of off-the-shelf alternatives that are available right now. And also making sure that how we get our products to our consumers is done in a low or no carbon way. In terms of downstream, so the engagement with consumers, I'd say, first of all, customers. So we do a lot of engagement with our customers, companies like Walmart, like Amazon. They're really interested in what we're doing, and on joint communication around things like regenerative agriculture, of course. And then there's the labeling piece, Sam, that you mentioned. So working on how do you put an eco label on a product, which helps people understand very quickly and in a non-complicated way what the potential impact of that product is vis-a-vis another competitor product on the shelf. And I think we need to strive for that as an industry. I think there's been a lot of progress on nutrition labeling, and now we need to expand that into the eco labeling space as well. And there's a lot of developments in Europe in that regard. I think in other parts of the world it's less well developed, but we'll see that coming in due course. So all of those things that I'm talking about rely on collaboration, and so we're working with quite often with competitors on a non-competitive basis. Regenerative agriculture, again, I reference it because we're working with companies like Danone, like Unilever, on what are the techniques that we're talking about here, what works, how can we share best practice and projects that have been successful. And then, collaboration at a government level. I think it was said before that we need clarity, we need regulatory certainty, we need to see ambitious commitments and targets turn into something concrete, which we can understand and incorporate into our own business model. So it's really right across the chain, I would say, collaboration is essential for success.
Excellent. And Jonas, let's pick up with you. And I think it would be great just to, maybe at the end, just to reflect, or you might offer that back to any of the other panelists, this sort of competition versus collaboration, because competition obviously can be a very driving, very dynamic force. And, I don't think people are saying we're going to collaborate and just, all join a commune and just sort of all work together. I think there is still obviously plenty of competition and competitive edge around. So it'd just be really interesting to hear your views on that as well.
Yeah. And let me come back to that because I like that question. But if I start off with, well, when we set our climate strategy, we named it "Electrification is not enough," because as you touched upon, the operations or emissions in our operation is not the sort of biggest chunk. Our scope 3 emissions is not roughly 99.5% of our total emissions. So therefore, of course, we need to tackle those. And even though we go for an electric car, the electric car is not a silver bullet either, because, well, if I refer back to an LCA that we did on one of our recent cars, the conclusion is rather clear that, of course, we need the electric car, but it needs to be charged renewably. Otherwise, it will be slightly better, but it won't be the silver bullet. And then if we charge it renewably, then we need to ensure that everything we source and everything we ask our suppliers to do to produce the components going into that car, these emissions needs to be reduced. And I think that is putting the finger on the need for collaboration, because 2 weeks ago, we announced a collaboration with Swedish steel company SSAB to explore the use of fossil-free produced steel in a car. And steel is one of the biggest categories of emission in the car, so therefore that is going to be very interesting to see how can we make use of that to reduce emissions from steel. And last week we communicated our joint venture with the battery manufacturer Northvolt, because batteries is also a critical part of the emissions. So we need to go beyond what we do and both collaborate and vertically integrate to, well, together with our suppliers, drive down these emissions. And we don't have all the answers, and neither do they, but together we might get there. And I think that is key here. And I think that is the connection back to your question, that in a few areas, we can do something like Owen mentioned regarding labeling to show how do we stand in comparison to someone else, and that can drive competition. But the key to me is the transparency and the data accuracy and the trustability of the data, because since it's a rather immature area and the methodology and the data sets is not really set yet, you can more or less do a correct LCA, but the results is very, very different. So it wouldn't really be comparable. But how we set it up is going to be key if we can make it into a competitive, well, differentiator or not. Because right now I could more or less show the same car with two different results. Both would be correct, but one would look better than the other, just due to the choices of assumptions or choices of data sets. And that to me is one key here. I think we can drive competition, or we can collaborate with competition upstream in terms of driving the development and collaborate like that. But it will be tricky to, well, we need to, but the one key challenge is to get to what Nestle have started doing, but for the car manufacturing industry, to compare results of CO2 emissions and make it comparable for the customer, because I think it's easy to get lost there. But yeah, very important question though.
Great, Jonas, thank you. John, what do you think?
It's fascinating. So collaboration for us, there's two parts to it. There's investor collaboration, and very happy to go through that. How we operate with how we cooperate with other shareholders to try and get change among the companies that we're both invested in. As listed investors, or investors in listed companies, we often own a very small amount of a company. So it's very hard for us to have influence on a company on our own. So instead, we will try and collaborate where perhaps the company is not hearing the message that we're giving. But there's another part to the collaboration that we look at, and that is the collaboration among companies, exactly what Jonas and Owen are talking about. Because for us, that's extremely important. If we take, say, energy companies, for example, we can beat them up about supply. We can talk about divestment. But if you remember that the super majors control about 15% of oil supply in the world, the vast majority is controlled by the national oil companies. So even if you get these companies to divest, there's nothing really happening on the supply side. The national oil company is probably buying those assets from the super majors. But how about instead if we get these energy companies to collaborate with other industries to try and kill the demand? So to give you an example, what's hard with, and Jonas, please come in here, and because when you think about electric vehicles, there is that range anxiety among customers, and among energy companies. There's, well, if we put out a network and there are no cars there, then that investment is lost. So there's that first mover problem. Who's going to take the risk? So what we need to see is energy companies collaborating with other sectors, so that first mover problem is solved, that they're unlocking these problems. And one of the issues we'd have with energy companies when they talk about their targets, their emission reduction targets moving in step with society, we would say that's not good enough. You've got to move society. You're in a position to move society. And we've seen this happen. We've seen the majors, they're starting to collaborate with individual car companies so that problem is unlocked. And therefore you hit demand. So I think sometimes there's a displacement activity, if you like, focusing on the supply and trying to divest these assets. Instead, we as investors want to see the companies unlock the problem. And that I think is a much better form of collaboration. a little bit like the energy companies, the super majors having 15% of oil supply, you can move to a different sector, say the food sector, and you think about food waste. Food waste accounts for about 7% of global emissions. So that's food loss and food waste. So we put pressure on the food retailers that we're invested in to try and cut that waste. And in the UK, they're doing good work. They've got very, very ambitious targets. But when we look through and we see that actually the food retailers account for 3% of food waste in the UK, the real waste is lost in the home, 70%. So instead, you've got to try and get those food retailers to figure out not just the waste within their operations, but downstream. How can they try and solve the bigger problem, which is food waste in the home? And that's what investors have been calling for, and that's what they've been responding to. So two examples of collaboration we like to see and we want to see at a company level, rather than what would traditionally be seen when we talk about investor collaboration among shareholders.
Okay, thank you, John. So Jonas, I think there was an opportunity for you to come back on that, but perhaps just before you do that, if I could ask you a question, John. I mean, your lens is primarily through data, right? So, I mean, maybe that's not right, but that's what I imagine, yeah? And so, now you're talking about the importance of supply chains up and downstream and collaboration. How good a view how good a sight of that do you actually have? Is it sufficient?
It's very difficult. Data is our biggest challenge. We don't have the disclosures coming from companies, so that's not there yet. SFDR, in a way, the regulation that we're facing is demanding us to produce data that's not there yet. So in a way, the cart is before the horse, in that companies need to disclose, and then we will have the data. In the absence of disclosures from companies, we will use alternative data, and that will fill the gap, if you like. But then the risk for companies is that the information it's outside their control. It's not their data. It might be misrepresentative. And I think that's what I would really encourage companies to see, is that in the absence of they making their disclosures, somebody else will try and find a proxy, and that may not be accurate. It may not be what they would see is a correct representation. I would make one other point, and perhaps Owen wants to come in on it. The problem we have is with collaboration and targets, ambitious targets. We need to actually see progress on those targets being met. I guess there's so much excitement, and Sam, you referred to this in your opening remarks. There's so much excitement around targets that what we fail to maybe think about at times is that targets are just targets. They're not actually there's not progress being made. And as we're saying, it's hard for us to sometimes understand what progress is being made. But there was a report done by Changing Markets Foundation about companies that were using plastic. It was called Talking Trash. And this just focused on all the promises that had been made from the 1990s all the way through about how companies were going to take plastics out of their operations or out of their products, and it just did not happen. And Nestle came out and said, well, the reason for that was there wasn't industry collaboration around it. So again, it was a failure of collaboration there to make that happen. So while we can get very excited about collaboration now, this is not just happening for the first time. We've seen attempts to collaborate in the past that have failed. So we need to see progress. It's sometimes hard because of the lack of data, but ultimately that's what we need to get our heads around. How can we track progress companies are made? And of course, data is not just about collaboration, it is across companies and different sustainability issues.
I'll come in briefly as to answer the question that you mentioned, John, because I very much agree that there is a hen and egg problem in terms of electric cars versus charging infrastructure to be able to use them. And I think our take so far is that we need to be unusually clear on our very long-term commitment to at least show our intent. Usually we don't disclose our strategies 10 years ahead, but in this case, we tell out loud that this is the route we're taking. And to be frank, of course, we don't know what the world will look like in 2030, but we believe this is the best strategic bet we can do. And we hope, therefore, that others see that, in this case, if there will be a big volume of electric cars, there will be a need for it. So therefore, they can see the direction we're taking. And then, of course, we need to collaborate with the different market electricity producers and the charging point operators to help them as well. But at least sort of just telling out loud what our intent is, I think that is a first important step that many companies, well, hesitate to do.
Can I just come in on sort of to answer to the wider question? I think John's great point on data and actually showing progress against goals. We're spending time at the moment trying to plan our roadmap to our 2030 science-based targets. And as I said, business, and that's sort of the most of our scope 3 is our franchise hotels. It's actually working out how to get those individual small business owners to take the action that we need them to take, especially at a time where they're just currently trying to focus on, say, so I think it was interesting what Lord Bilimoria was talking about, decarbonisation of buildings and having, you know, a central delivery body. These are all kind of things that we're looking at. And again, that base, thinking about how we can incentivize them to then setting them those targets, gathering the data to enable progress to be made. So that's a huge area of focus for us. I think something else which is really interesting, on back to the point around eco-labeling, there's a huge call in the hotel industry for something straightforward to show what is a green hotel. So there's so much, there are many certifications out there for buildings, for operation, absolute minefield. If you're a specialist in that area, then that's great, but to your average consumer, a bit like sort of the star system for hotels, how do you think about to demonstrate in an easy way but meaningful way what is a green hotel? So the hotel industry is collaborating a lot. We've done a lot already around back to data, around standardizing methodologies for measuring carbon and measuring water, and that's through, we have there's an industry body called the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance. So I think that's worked really well for us as an industry, and we're doing more around food waste management because we recognise that's a really big point as well. So I think our industry in particular, there's a huge amount of collaboration both within our own company, within the industry, and more widely looking outside how we can take on learnings from others to bring back inside our industry.
Great, thank you. And
could I just adjust the point earlier around plastics? So I think it's just an example of an issue that requires a system-wide change. So if you try to change your packaging material and you know, your retailer won't accept it, or it doesn't comply with food safety regulations, or you can't recycle it in certain countries, or it's too expensive and you become uncompetitive, it won't work. You need to have a system-wide change whereby you create a culture of reuse or recycling in many different countries, and you create the pathways for materials to kind of go through the whole cycle. And so I think where efforts failed in the past, it was due to it being too specific and focused on one particular intervention and not enough on the system-wide change required. And I think the same applies to climate. So, you know, I've talked a lot about farming, and that's really a massive system, right? So we could change the practices of a few of our farmers. It's not really going to change the trajectory that we're on to collectively, which is not a good one. You know, you need to really create a system-wide change, which is why we do things like engage with the European Commission on their common agricultural policy and how that could be used to incentivize farmers much more broadly, you know, see a much bigger change. And that benefits Nestlé because it's in line with what we want, but it more importantly affects the system and creates the opportunities for us to deliver change in line with our own climate roadmap.
If I may just come in there to one spot, I think that's absolutely spot on. You know, we can focus on small projects that get us some attention. You know, it's good PR, but it doesn't really move the needle at all, and that's absolutely fundamental. I would say that there are displacement activities where it makes us feel good that we're doing something, but we're not really going to change anything in the broader picture. So I totally agree with what Owen said.
Yeah, and I think that collaborate. I mean, it's difficult doing something, obviously a big new initiative within an organization when you've got control and you employ people. I think it's very difficult when it's a, coalition of willing people who perhaps don't have resources, and, perhaps the direction of travel of the initiative doesn't completely align to your corporate, but it's the best opportunity. So just in terms of sort of the mechanics of, or examples of good collaboration and perhaps things which are more challenging, I just see it as just almost inevitably more difficult. Yes, of course, perhaps the only way to address some of the systemic challenges that you've talked about, but also very difficult, more difficult typically than spinning up a, change program or a new initiative within your own organization. So just any reflections on sort of where you feel you've been successful or you've seen success, what is it that has enabled that versus perhaps the many initiatives which have big ambitions, look promising, but actually get stuck in the mud?
Yeah, I think some of the success will come on climate. I think there's a lot of it that's still kind of in the formulation phase. So I think companies went through this big process of taking the step up in ambition and then realizing that requires these changes that we just talked about and this collaboration level, which hasn't previously been explored. So I think a lot of stuff will come on the agricultural side and on the packaging side. I think there's a lot of collaboration going on there. For example, we recently announced very much more recyclable PET type of PET plastic, right, which is broken down through enzyme technology, and that enzyme technology is shared with other companies. So all of the companies can benefit from that, with certain companies adding their expertise to bring it to market. So this type of collaboration, I think, is really exciting because it offers a level playing field for people to say, okay, well, now we know PET is much more recyclable. We can change our portfolio to that, or we can improve consumer communication around the importance of recycling that product. And so that's a good example. I think on the trucking side, on the logistics side, there's some good collaboration going on. We are members of the European Clean Trucking Alliance, and that has recently got to a point where the big manufacturers have now agreed to transition, to electric or hydrogen vehicles, I think in Europe by 2040 at the latest. This is for heavy vehicles. I guess maybe Volvo is part of that, I'm not sure. But, that again, I think is a great example of shifting the needle, by saying, okay, big companies together can say, we need this change on logistics, and then the manufacturers see the demand signal and they can act, and they can create their own commitment and action plan.
Got it. Anybody else got a view on that? Something to offer? Just sort of how do we make sure that something is potentially quite difficult to manage? How do we make sure it succeeds? Any tips for others who are listening?
One reflection from me, perhaps, that is at least adjacent to what you say. When we set our sort of communicated our ambitions, how to reduce CO2 for our supply chain and our suppliers, quite often they came back to us and more or less said, well, this is easy, we'll do it. We will use quite a lot of offsets to do it. And just being very clear that, well, we are not accepting any offsetting at all. We should reduce CO2 was a rather interesting conversation started, because the ingoing value of many of them was more or less that, of course, we can do it. We can buy the offsets. And to me, I think, of course, at some point in time, if we are to reach net zero, we likely need to compensate for the unavoidable emissions. But at the moment, we can reduce CO2, and we should focus on reducing CO2. And that conversation started was rather key for us, and very much sort of, triggering the reduction initiatives at them instead of only focusing on the easy way out. To more or less be, as some call us, a bit purist, that, we don't accept it at all at the moment. At some point might be, but not at all at the moment.
That's fascinating, if I may come in there, Jonas, because science-based targets would say exclude offsets. So you have to take the actual emissions out of the supply chain. Of course, some companies won't be able to get to the science-based targets. And then there's discussion or debate going on within finance about whether offsets should be allowed, because sometimes it will support the just transition. right? So we've seen it in Gabon this week, how they have received funding from the Norwegian government because they have been able to conserve and expand the rainforest there. So it's a real interesting area and discussion about what offsets should we allow, where it may support, as I said, the transition. And on the other hand, we've had issues around unbundled renewable energy credits in the US, where there was no additionality, if you like. It was just an unbundling of something that was there. So there was nothing really done to take more emissions out than would have been taken out in any way. So a very interesting discussion on our side of the fence about whether they should be allowed or not. As you said, I think the really hard to abate sectors, you might give them some leeway there. But we would encourage people to go for the science-based targets in many ways. One, it gives us a lot of comfort as generalists, as investors who really perhaps won't understand the fine detail. The science-based targets give us a lot of comfort about companies' plans, about the plans really being aligned with the Paris Agreement.
And I can just build on that, because I very much agree with you. We have science-based targets, so therefore I very much stay with this position. But of course, there are, well, not all offsets are bad. There are good offsets. And if we talk about carbon removals, well, there is also an interesting discussion. We need to develop this market. So someone needs to buy it rather early. And if everyone would do like we do, of course, that market wouldn't develop. So of course it is a balance, but that, well, rather firm position have really helped our discussions with the suppliers that we are not doing it at all at the moment. And then the caveat is perhaps in an accounting perspective. I think there can be a value of buying carbon removals to develop the market, but you should not use it to sort of reduce your emissions and show that you're zero emission, rather help the development of the market.
Okay, so unfortunately we've run out of time. I mean, that in itself is a topic we could have an hour and a half on, absolutely, you know, and we could see that expanding and blowing out, so it could be fascinating. So I think, you know, we've obviously heard from Lord Bilimoria, so that was around planning, partnerships and passion on full display, but the partnerships bit really important, obviously, as we've just heard. We heard from Tom about sort of really an update and that high probability of hitting 1.5 globally at some time during the next decade, which is just terrifying. But then the importance of resilience and adaptation, almost by definition, because of that. And then we've really asked the panelists and heard their answers on two different topics. One was sort of what's causing the change, and then how are you reacting that at an organizational level. And the second is the sort of initiatives that are working outside of your operational boundaries, upstream and downstream, and the importance of collaboration. So thank you very much indeed for everybody who contributed. Thank you very much indeed for everybody who participated. And just in the last few seconds, please, if I could just remind you and point you to the platform, the Goal 13 Impact platform. Please participate, contribute, you know, come and join us on a panel, you know, get your information up online, share it. And just remember that point about the partnerships that Lord Karen said. And then, of course, all those great reasons for why collaboration is so important, reinforced by AHG, by Volvo, by Nestle, and by the capital markets and the guys of RWC partners. So thank you very much indeed. Have great days. Farewell.